All right, this is not a SQL Server error, but it does relate to SQL Server, and it's usually an error that you see with deployment software, different deployment softwares. And so it depends, the error may be different derivatives. In this case, this derivative would be pre-update schema check failed. The schema in the release my database and database my database on server are different. So we're going to look at what's happening here, and this is a little complicated, so I'm going to use kind of a contrived example in an environment where we are only deploying stored procedures. So we source control our objects in the database, and we do not deploy tables, we do not deploy functions, we do not deploy views, we only are deploying stored procedures. So we may be adding stored procedures, we may be removing stored procedures, or we may be changing existing stored procedures. But we're not doing that with tables, we're not doing that with views, we're not doing that with functions or anything else. So we have two databases here. We have the live database, this would be the database on the server, and we have the source control database, this would be the database that we're deploying. So when we are deploying the source control database, and it is doing a comparison between the live database and the source control database, since we're only deploying procedures, what it's going to do is it's going to compare the stored procedures that exist in the live to the ones in the source control, and if there's changes, it's going to write the alter script, and if they don't exist, it's going to write the create script. And then if, let's say, the source control database does not have a stored procedure that this live database has, it's going to write a drop script. So that's what should happen. However, some source control software, or I'm sorry, some deployment software, I said that wrong, does a pre-update of schema. And the reason why is, let's imagine that we had a stored procedure that ran a select statement like this. However, we ran an alter table statement that changed the column name to just our date, right? Well, that means that any stored procedure that runs a select statement using or referencing rep date is going to be incorrect. Now, even though we don't deploy the table changes in our contrived example, somebody went ahead and changed the table anyway. And so what happens in that case is that objects in the source control database that shouldn't change have been changed and now differ from the live database, right? So in our contrived example, and again, in a lot of environments, tables do change and functions do change and views do change, but in our contrived example, tables are not supposed to change, right? And so when it does this schema check between these two, what it finds is, wait a minute, the table in source control is different than the table in live, right? And that it may or may not, but that may have an effect on stored procedures. And so in this case, what it does is it fails because it says, hey, these objects are different, and that's not something that should happen. And it only should be different between objects that we're actually deploying. So let me be very clear, this is not an error that you're going to get in some environments, because let's say you deploy every change to any object in a database, then there may not be this error that you ever see, because fundamentally the idea is you might be changing something in, let's say, a table, something in a view, something in a function, something in a schema, something in a type, etc., 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 right? And so the idea here is that if you have something that you don't change, but yet somebody does make that change, we have to think about the fact that the live database does not have those changes. We're deploying changes. Well, it comes and it picks up this source control database when it creates it and does the comparison, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, the table that was ETL report is now our date instead of rep date, and that's different than the live database, which is rep date and not our date. And so that's what's going on here. So yes, that is a contrived example, and different software will probably have different forms of errors, but we have to think about fundamentally, and the reason why I wanted to talk about this fundamentally, if, and this is where the issue was in this developer's case, but fundamentally, if the live database is going to differ with any object that our source control database has, and we're not deploying those objects, right, then there's going to be a clash. And the worst thing that could happen is if we had software that went ahead and deployed it. I mean, think about, again, the same example. So if our source control had the table name as our date and the stored procedures were updated, but the live database was still referring it to as rep date. So what happens when, again, that table doesn't change in the live database, only the stored procedures are, but now all those stored procedures are referring to our date on the ETL report, well, they're going to fail in the live database, right? And so that's why if there are objects that we're not deploying, we do want a check to validate that those objects in source control and those objects in the live database are still matching. Because if they do change, that could potentially, I mean, it's possible that we change an object that's not even referenced anywhere, but that could potentially cause major issues. So this is one of those errors that you might not see depending on the environment you're in, and then you might see a different type of error in in the software that you're using. But fundamentally what's going on is we're comparing a live database that's currently used to a database from source control that we're about to make changes to that live database. And they're not equal with objects that should not be changing. And that's key. Because again, if we are, let's say, deploying these stored procedures and the stored procedures don't match, well, we want those stored procedures to be scripted in a way that they're either changed, added, or removed, right? But if we're only changing a few objects, we don't want there to be changes to other objects that we never want changed. And that's why I said earlier, some environments this doesn't apply, because there are some environments out there that every object in a database can be changed depending on what's checked into source control.